Give her a second. Logging in. So hello, everyone, and welcome. So thanks so much for joining us today. We'll get started here in just a moment as others continue to log in. But while you're waiting, you see those cool QR codes there. You can feel free to connect with us on social media. Just go ahead and scan it with your phone, easy peasy. My name is Stacy Padgington. I am the sales director here at Checkpoint EHR, and I will be your host for today's session. So a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. Just a couple things. Everyone's muted. That really does just help keep the session running smoothly. We'll save some time at the end for a dedicated Q&A session, so please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. You'll notice that little square at the bottom there that's been highlighted in the Q&A is where you want to put those questions. And today's webinar is also being recorded and a copy will be made available afterwards. So we appreciate everyone taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us today. So thank you. So I'm joined today by Katie Fournier, our Director of Operations and Customer Success, who will be helping moderate throughout the session. And we're also very excited to welcome today's presenter, Troy Kane, a licensed clinical mental health counselor supervisor. Troy is both a clinician and someone who has been through the acquisition process firsthand as a practice founder, seller, and operator. So he does bring real world perspective on what mergers and acquisitions mean for behavioral health organizations. So we're really excited to have him. So before we dive into today's topic, I just want to take a moment to share a little bit about Checkpoint EHR, if you don't mind. So for more than 20 years, we've partnered with behavioral health organizations to help simplify operations, improve workflows, and support your long-term success. So at Checkpoint EHR, we believe an EHR should be far more than just a documentation system. It should serve as the mission-critical infrastructure to your organization. So from clinical documentation and billing workflows to operational visibility and compliance support, organizations depend on their EHR every single day to keep operations running effectively and efficiently. And as organizations continue to face increasing oversight, payer scrutiny, and operational complexity, having strong systems and processes in place has never been more important. Our goal is to help providers reduce administrative burden, improve visibility across the organization, and ultimately support the people serving clients every single day. So, and how we support you. So at Checkpoint EHR, we focus on helping organizations create operational consistency while reducing administrative burden, of course. That includes things like automated billing workflows, reporting visibility, documentation support, and tools that help organizations stay audit ready. So we understand that compliance isn't just about passing an audit, it's about protecting your organization, your revenue, and ultimately your ability to continue serving clients effectively. So, let's shift to today's focus. So when we get to today's focus, mergers and acquisitions in behavioral health, protecting the people and relationships that created your practice's value. This is an incredibly relevant topic right now as more behavioral health organizations are receiving acquisition inquiries, weighing growth or succession, or navigating a change in ownership. And whether or not a sale is ever on the table, the decisions around it touch clients, clinicians, culture, and mission, not just the balance sheet. So that's why we're so fortunate to have Troy Kane joining us today. Troy has lived this from every side, a clinician, a founder who built and sold group practices, and an operator who has seen the reality on the other side of that transaction. So what I appreciate most about Troy's approach is that it's clinical first and practical, not just deal mechanics, but real guidance you can apply to protect what matters most, whatever your next move looks like. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Troy. And that's a nice photo, Troy, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. That's my dog Chewbacca. And Yeah, he's very helpful to me in many ways. So I appreciate the introduction. And Katie, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and have you share and we'll start with the first slide, and I'll get started here. I want to welcome everybody. As already mentioned, my name is Troy, and I'd like to first start by thanking everybody with Checkpoint for hosting today's webinar and for inviting me to discuss mergers and acquisitions in behavioral health. When people hear the phrase mergers and acquisitions, I think oftentimes we think about purchase prices, contracts, revenue, valuations, and negotiations. And I recognize that those things are very important, but today I want to begin a little bit differently. I'm approaching this topic first as a licensed clinical mental health counselor supervisor. And so for me, that means my first questions are not simply how much is the practice worth? What will the buyer pay? Or how quickly can the transaction be completed? My first questions are what happens to the clients? What happens to the clinicians? What happens to the relationships, the culture, and the mission that created the value of the practice in the first place? A behavioral health practice is not simply a business. It is a collection of relationships built on trust. It makes a merger or an acquisition in behavioral health fundamentally different from purchasing an ordinary commercial asset. And I want to help us think about a transaction today in a way that not only is financially sound, but also being operationally workable, ethically defensible, and personally right for the owner. I should clarify that I'm not presenting as an attorney or an accountant, nor a tax professional or an investment advisor. And this presentation is educational. It reflects my experience as a clinician, a supervisor, a practice owner, a seller, and a healthcare operations leader. Any actual transaction should involve qualified legal, accounting, tax, and compliance professionals to help you guide through that process. And before we go any further, I would like all of you to consider one question. What would make a transaction financially successful, but still leave you regretting the decision? And I encourage you to keep that question in mind as we move through the presentation. And Katie, if you're able to go to slide 2, that would be great. So let me give a little context about why this topic is both professional and personal for me. I have worked in behavioral health for about 20 years, primarily as a clinician, a clinical supervisor, and a group practice leader. During that time, I have founded 3 group practices, and I understand what it means to start with an idea, find clients, recruit clinicians, negotiate payer contracts, implement systems, manage payroll, respond to problems, and gradually build something that has real value. One of the practices I founded was eventually acquired by Optum. That experience gave me the opportunity to see an acquisition from the perspective of a founder and seller. I experienced the process of preparing the organization, evaluating the opportunity, navigating the transaction, and considering what the acquisition would mean for the practice and the people connected to it. After the acquisition, I remained with the organization and later served as the VP of operations for Optum in North Carolina. That allowed me to experience the other side of the transaction. I was no longer looking at the acquisition only as the person who had built and sold the practice. I was also working within the larger organization and seeing what happens after the agreements are signed. I saw how decisions made during a transaction eventually affect operations, clinicians, leadership, culture, and client care. That is an important distinction because closing the transaction is not the end. In many ways, it's just the beginning. And so today I continue to work as a clinician, a supervisor, an entrepreneur through the counseling clinic, another group practice that I've started, and an organization called Mental Health Education Online. I bring several perspectives into the conversation. I've been the clinician, I've been the supervisor, I've been the founder and the owner, and I've been the seller. And I've worked as an operational leader inside the acquiring organization. I do not believe that every acquisition is good, and I do not believe that every acquisition is bad. The real question is whether the transaction is aligned with the needs of the owner, the organization, the clinicians, and most importantly, the clients. And that's the perspective I want to bring into our conversation today. Katie, if you could go to slide 3, that would be great. You may be an owner who has received an unexpected email or a telephone call from someone interested in acquiring your practice. You may be actively considering an exit, retirement, or a succession plan. You may be a practice leader preparing for growth, bringing in a partner, or thinking about what should happen to the organization when you're no longer running it. You may be considering acquiring another practice and want to complete that process without damaging the culture, your relationships, and reputation that you've made. Or you may even be a clinical worker working with an organization that is experiencing or may eventually experience a change in ownership. Regardless of which role best describes you, all of these issues matter. You do not need to be ready to sell before you begin preparing your practice. In fact, the systems that make a practice attractive to a responsible buyer are generally the same systems that make it more ethical, stable, efficient, and manageable for its current owners. Accurate records matter whether you sell or not. Clear policies matter whether you sell or not. A dependable EHR, organized financial information, appropriate access controls, strong clinical supervision, and consistent operating procedures all matter whether a transaction ever occurs. Being prepared also gives you choices. If an opportunity appears unexpectedly, preparation allows you to evaluate it thoroughly rather than reacting from fear, exhaustion, or financial pressure. It also allows you to say no. Transaction readiness does not mean that you have decided to sell. It means that you understand your organization well enough to make an informed decision if an opportunity presents itself. As we move through the presentation, I will invite all of you to listen from your current role, but also to consider how these issues might affect the other people connected to the practice. How would you approach these decisions from another role? As owner, a buyer, a clinician, and a client may experience the exact same transaction very, very differently. Can we go to slide 4? Before evaluating an offer, it's important to understand why an owner might consider a transaction and what a buyer may be hoping to acquire. When a practice owner receives an acquisition inquiry, the owner and the buyer may be looking at the same practice very differently. The owner may be thinking, I'm tired. I don't want to deal with payroll. I don't want to deal with credentialing or billing or personnel problems. I've spent years building, and I'm ready to receive something in return. What happens to the practice if I become sick or want to retire or simply don't want to carry all the responsibility anymore? Those are personal decisions. The buyer, however, may be looking at the practice and seeing something very different. They may see a group of credentialed clinicians who would be difficult to recruit individually. They may see payer contracts that would take considerable time to establish. They may be an existing referral network, a recognizable name, consistent revenue, a geographic foothold, or an opportunity to enter a new specialty. The owner may be seeing years of sacrifice, relationships, and responsibility. The buyer may be seeing an opportunity to acquire infrastructure and accelerate growth. Neither perspective is wrong, but they're definitely not the same perspective. That's why the owner needs to understand something really important. The buyer is not offering to purchase your practice simply because they appreciate how hard you worked. They believe the practice contains value that can help them accomplish their goals. Your responsibility is to become equally clear about your own goals. In my experience, one of the most important questions is not, is this a good offer? The more important question is, what problem am I asking this offer to solve? Because if the problem is not clearly defined, almost any offer can begin to look attractive, especially when you're burnt out or you're exhausted. Maybe the problem is succession. You've created something meaningful, but the entire organization still depends on you. Maybe the problem is scale. The practice has reached a point where it needs stronger technology, better leadership, compliance, or financial infrastructure. Maybe the problem is financial. You've created value, but most of that value exists inside the practice rather than in your personal financial security. Or maybe the problem is that you have accidentally built yourself a demanding job instead of a transferable business. It can be difficult for owners to acknowledge. If the practice cannot operate without you, if the important relationships exist only through you, or if the essential processes live primarily in your head, a buyer may not see the same value that you see. They may see risk. This is where honesty becomes important. Are you moving toward a well-considered opportunity? Or are you hoping that a transaction will rescue you from exhaustion? When I sold my practice, I learned that a transaction does not simply remove responsibility. It changes the nature of your responsibility, your authority, and your relationship with the organization you've created. You may receive support and financial opportunity, but you may also give up control. You may remain involved, but no longer have the final say. You may still care deeply about the organization, but now be working within someone else's priorities and systems. Those realities need to be considered before the purchase price becomes the center of the conversation. So before asking, how much is my practice worth? I would encourage an owner to ask, what do I want my life to look like after this? What authority am I willing to give up? What parts of the practice am I willing to compromise? What parts of the practice am I unwilling to compromise? What will happen to my clinicians? What will happen to our clients? And perhaps most importantly, if the financial terms are attractive, but the transaction changes the practice in ways I cannot support, am I prepared to say no? Your why becomes the standard against which the offer is evaluated. Without that clarity, the buyer's goals can quietly become the plan for your future. Can we go to slide 5? If we look at the left side of this slide, we see the things that are relative and easy to identify and measure: revenue, contracts, records. A buyer can review financial statements, examine payer contracts, count active clinicians, study referral patterns, and evaluate the client consensus. Those things are important. They help establish the financial and operational value of the practice, but they do not tell the entire story. They do not fully explain why a client trusted your practice enough to call for help. They do not explain why a referral partner chose to send someone to you instead of another organization. They do not capture the relationship between a client and a clinician, or the trust a clinician placed in you when they decided to join your practice. Those relationships may have taken years to develop, but they can be damaged very quickly during a poorly managed transition. This is one of the tensions that makes behavioral health acquisitions different from many other business transactions. The client is not a unit of inventory. We cannot simply say the practice has 500 active clients and those clients will now belong to the buyer. It's important to remember that clients have autonomy. They have relationships with particular clinicians. They may have chosen the practice because of its reputation, its mission, accessibility, values, or the way they were treated when they first reached out for help. A signed purchase agreement does not automatically transfer that trust. The same is true for clinicians. An employment agreement may establish certain legal obligations, but it does not guarantee that a clinician will remain committed to the organization after the culture, leadership, compensation, productivity expectations, or clinical policy changes. A buyer may technically acquire the practice and then discover that some of its most important value walks out the door. Clients may leave. Clinicians may leave. Referral partners may begin sending people elsewhere. And that is why the relational side of due diligence matters just as much as the financial side. A buyer should be asking, why do clinicians stay here? Why do clients choose this practice? Where do referrals come from? How dependent are those relationships on the current owner? What happens to those relationships when leadership changes? And the seller should be asking, does this buyer understand what made the practice successful? Will they protect the relationships that created its value? Or do they see clients primarily as revenue and clinicians primarily as production capacity? I think this is where my identity as a counselor becomes especially important. As business owners, we absolutely need to understand revenue, contracts, expenses, and values. But as counselors, our primary responsibility does not suddenly disappear because a transaction is taking place. The people represented in the financial reports are still clients who trusted us with some of the most vulnerable parts of their life. So when we evaluate a transaction, the question cannot simply be, what is the practice worth? We also have to ask what and who created that value. And what must be protected so that the transaction does not destroy the very thing the buyer is purchasing. Can we go to slide 6? So that brings us to our ethical responsibilities. I want to be clear about my perspective here. I'm approaching this discussion as a licensed clinical mental health counselor supervisor. An attorney will appropriately focus on whether the agreement protects the parties legally. An accountant will focus on the financial information. tax consequences, and structure of the transaction. Those perspectives are essential. But the ACA Code of Ethics asks counselors to begin somewhere else. It asks us to begin with the welfare of the client. The purchase agreement may define who owns the business, but our ethical responsibilities help define how the people affected by that transaction must be treated. I've identified 5 ethical areas that I believe deserve particular attention during a merger or an acquisition. The first is client welfare. The ACA standard A1A tells us that our primary responsibility is to respect the dignity and promote the welfare of clients. That word primary, I think, is really important. It means client welfare is not simply one factor among many competing business interests. So I need to ask, will this transaction improve care? Will clients have greater access to service or more resources? Or could new productivity requirements, staffing changes, or financial expectations interfere with appropriate clinical care? The second area is informed consent. Informed consent is not something we complete once during intake and then file away. It's an ongoing process. If a transaction changes who provides the service, how services are delivered, what clients pay, which insurance plans are accepted, how technology is used, or how records are maintained, clients may need clear information about those changes. They also need to understand their choices. A carefully written announcement is not necessarily the same as a meaningful informed consent. We need to ask whether clients genuinely understand what is changing, what is staying the same, and what options they have if they do not want to continue. The third area is avoiding harm. A transaction can create uncertainty for everyone involved. Clinicians may not know whether they will retain their positions. Clients may worry about losing their counselor. Leaders may feel pressure to keep the practice stable while being unable to disclose everything occurring behind the scenes. Some disruption may be unavoidable, but that does not remove our obligation to anticipate the potential harm and take reasonable steps to minimize it. The fourth area is continuity of care. The ACA code addresses appropriate transfer of service and specifically tells us not to abandon or neglect clients. It becomes particularly important if clinicians leave, insurance participation changes, programs close, or the buyer decides that certain services are no longer financially sustainable. It is not enough to say the transaction is complete and those clients are now someone else's responsibility. There must be a thoughtful clinical and an administrative transition. Who will contact the clients? Who will respond to urgent concerns? How will referrals be handled? What happens if a client wants to remain with their current clinician? Who is responsible for following up when someone is at an elevated risk? Those questions need answers before the transaction begins. And finally, the fifth area, confidentiality. This is one of the places where business due diligence and clinical ethics can collide. A prospective buyer will reasonably want information about the practice. They may want to understand the number of active clients, types of services provided, payer mix, diagnoses, utilization patterns. But the desire to evaluate the business does not automatically give the buyer unrestricted access to identifiable client information. A non-disclosure agreement is important. but it does not by itself answer every legal and ethical question about access to clinical records. We still need to determine what information can be shared. Can the information be de-identified? Who's authorized to review it? Is client permission required? What privacy and security protections are in place? And are we disclosing only what is actually necessary? These 5 areas, client welfare, informed consent, avoiding harm, continuity, and confidentiality, give us a good solid starting point. They do not provide an automatic answer to every situation. Ethical decision-making requires us to identify the competing responsibilities, consult the relevant ethical standards and laws, seek professional documentation and consultation, consider the risks and benefits, and document how the decision was reached. That is also why attorneys, accountants, compliant professionals, and clinical leaders need to work together. The attorney should not be expected to make clinical decisions. The clinician should not attempt to provide legal advice, and the business owner should not make these decisions alone simply based on their own needs. The fundamental question is not only, can we complete this transaction? It is, can we complete it in a way that protects client welfare, preserves confidentiality, supports continuity of care, and allows clinicians to exercise appropriate professional judgment. And we go to slide 7. So let's apply those ethical responsibilities to a situation that could easily arise during an acquisition. Imagine that you own a behavioral health practice and a potential buyer approaches you with what sounds like a very attractive opportunity. They promise better technology, access to more resources, greater efficiency, increased profitability, and the ability to serve more clients. Those promises may be completely sincere, and they may ultimately benefit the practice. But then the buyer begins making requests. They want access to client records before the transaction closes. They want clinicians to meet higher productivity expectations. They suggest shortening sessions or changing how services are scheduled. And they want the authority to revise clinical policies after the acquisition. Now the conversation becomes more complicated. This does not automatically mean the buyer is unethical or that the transaction should not proceed. It means we need to slow down and pressure test the promises being made. Growth sounds positive, but growth for whom? Does it mean greater access to care for clients? Does it mean more support and better working conditions for clinicians? Does it mean a healthier and more sustainable organization? Or does it primarily mean increased revenue for the new owner? Those outcomes are not necessarily mutually exclusive. A practice can be financially successful and provide excellent care, but we should not simply assume that every financial incentive will support every clinical responsibility. So let's begin with the request for client records. A buyer may reasonably need information to understand the practice they are considering to acquire. They may want to evaluate documentation quality, billing practices, compliance risks, and the reliability of the organization's revenue. But their need to evaluate the business does not give them unrestricted access to identifiable clinical records. Before granting access, I would ask several questions. Exactly what information does the buyer need? Could this be information that's de-identified? Who's going to review the information? and what legal and ethical authority permits that access? How will the information be protected? A buyer may own the organization, but ownership should not erase professional responsibility. Clinicians remain accountable to their licenses, ethical standards, scope of practice, and the welfare of their clients. A policy created for operational efficiency cannot require a clinician to practice unethically. This is also where I would want to understand what happens if clinicians decide not to remain after the acquisition. Clients may have developed strong therapeutic relationships with particular clinicians. If those clinicians leave, who communicates with the clients? What options are clients given? Can they follow their clinician when legally and contractually permitted? How are high-risk clients supported during the transition? Those questions should be addressed before the announcement, not after people begin resigning. Finally, what choices do clients retain? As we all know, clients have the final say. They should not be treated as though they automatically transfer with the furniture, the lease, and the accounts receivable. They need understandable information about changes that affect their care. They need an opportunity to ask questions. They need to know their options. And whenever possible, they should have a meaningful voice in deciding what happens next. If I were advising the owner in this scenario, I would not begin with, is this buyer good or bad? I would begin with, what safeguards would need to be in place for those promises, or for these promises to become ethically responsible realities? That question gives us something concrete to evaluate. Who may access client information? Who retains authority over clinical decisions? How will clinicians and clients be treated during the transition? What happens if the transaction does not go according to plan? And are those protections clearly documented, or are we relying on assurances that have never been translated into policies or permissions or procedures? A good opportunity should be able to withstand thoughtful questions. And if basic ethical questions are treated as obstacles to the transaction, that response tells us something important about the transaction. This scenario highlights why the quality of your records and technology matters so much. You cannot appropriately control, evaluate, or transfer information if you do not know what you have, where it is, who can access it, or whether it is accurate. So next, on our next slide, I'd like to look at the EHR, not simply as software, but as evidence of how responsibly the practice operates. I think this scenario highlights why the quality of your records and technology matters so much. You cannot appropriately control, evaluate, or transfer information if you do not know what you have, where it is, who can access it, or whether it is accurate. So let's look at the EHR, not simply as software, but as evidence of how responsible the practice operates. When we hear electronic health record, it's easy to think about appointment reminders, progress notes, billing, and insurance claims. And those functions certainly matter. But during a merger or an acquisition, the EHR actually tells us a much larger story. It provides evidence of how the practice has actually been operating, not simply how the owner believes it's been operating. A buyer may ask, are client records complete? Are notes being entered consistently and on time? Do the services documented support the services billed? Are diagnoses, treatment plans, and progress notes consistent with one another? Can the practice identify who accessed or changed a record? Are permissions based on each person's role? And can the organization reliably produce the information it says it has? These are not only financial or operational questions, they are ethical questions because every one of them can affect the quality and continuity of client care. For example, imagine discovering during due diligence that several clinicians have months of incomplete documentation. That is not simply an administrative inconvenience. It may affect billing, compliance, continuity of care, the ability to respond to records requests, and the ability of another clinician to understand what has occurred during treatment. It can also change the value of the transaction or stop the transaction altogether. And this is why I say that your EHR is evidence. It can provide evidence of consistency or inconsistency. It can provide evidence of appropriate access controls or reveal that too many people can see too much information. It can demonstrate that the organization has dependable systems or show that the practice has been relying on one person's memory to keep everything together. And to be honest, many practice owners begin with a system that works when they have 5 clients, maybe 1 clinician, and then the practice grows. Suddenly there are multiple clinicians, multiple supervisors, administrative staff, contractors, interns, billing personnel, and hundreds of thousands of records. The informal process that once felt manageable becomes a serious vulnerability. A dependable EHR should help the practice answer some very practical questions. Who has access to what? What happens when someone joins or leaves the organization? How are records corrected or amended? How are releases of information documented? How are retention requirements managed? How are urgent clinical concerns communicated? Can the practice identify an incomplete note, a missing treatment plan, or an unsigned document before it becomes a larger problem? And what happens if the system or the practice itself experiences a disruption? If you're selling a practice, you should know the answers before a buyer asks. If you are acquiring a practice, you should not assume that the presence of an EHR means the records are organized, accurate, or secure. The platform matters and the implementation. A very capable system can still be used poorly. Permissions can be assigned incorrectly. Documentation standards can be inconsistent. Former employees can retain access longer than they should. Important information can be stored outside the designated record. Technology does not replace good policies or training or supervision nor accountability. It should support them. This is also an appropriate place for me to say something personal about Checkpoint. I've known the founders of Checkpoint for many years. I know the people behind the products, and I know the individuals, and I hold them in very high self-esteem. Let me say that a little bit differently. I hold them in very high esteem. I think it's probably been about 20 years since I first met the owners. And I really cannot say more or speak higher of them as it relates to trust and how I value and view them as ethical individuals. And to me, that matters. I value the system that they've developed, but my confidence in Checkpoint is not based only on a list of software features. It is based on trust. It is based on knowing the character of the people involved, their willingness to listen, and the customer support they bring to their service. Technology decisions in behavioral health are relationship decisions. When something goes wrong or when you are trying to make an important change, you need more than a help article or an automated response. I know many EHR systems that depend on that. Really great systems, but simply don't have that customer support. You need access to people who understand the system, appreciate the importance of the information being protected, and are willing to help you find a solution. I think I should pause and say thank you to Katie. I've known her for a number of years, and she's been one of those individuals that I trust, that shows up, that is able to help and answer questions when I needed answers. And that kind of support becomes especially important during a merger, an acquisition, or a transition in ownership. You may need to make changes to roles and permissions. You may need to preserve access for some individuals while ending it for others. You may need to understand how records can be reviewed, retained, protected, or transferred. You may also be trying to manage all that while continuing to serve clients without interruption. Those are moments when responsiveness, trust, and human support matter enormously. And I want to be transparent. Checkpoint is hosting this webinar, and I'm grateful for that support. But my appreciation is personal as well as professional. And I'm comfortable advocating for Checkpoint because I know the people. I trust the people. And I've seen the value they place on both their products and their customers. Ultimately, an EHR should not merely help a practice complete transactions. It should help the organization protect clients, support clinicians, maintain reliable records, and make responsible decisions. And that brings us to something technology alone cannot provide. Reliable systems also require reliable people. You go to slide 9, please.
Yeah, thanks for all the kind words. We appreciate you. We do have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, I think we're in a pretty good place then.
Okay, great.
So I'll say an EHR should not merely help a practice complete transactions. It should help the organization protect clients, support clinicians, maintain reliable records, and make responsible decisions. And that brings us to something technology alone can't provide. It is the people. We sometimes evaluate technology by asking, what can the system do? That's an important question. And I also believe it's not the only question. I think we need to ask, who will help us understand what the system can do? Who will help us configure it responsibly? Who will answer when something does not work as expected? And who will be there when the situation is complicated, time sensitive, or unfamiliar? I'm going to speak to Checkpoint one more time here. To be able to make a direct phone call and have access to somebody that I know and trust and that's competent, the value there for me was immeasurable. During an acquisition, those questions can become urgent very quickly. A client may be leaving the organization. A new owner may need access, but only to the information appropriate to that person's role. The organization may need to restructure permissions without interrupting client care. Someone may discover that records have been organized differently than expected. The parties may need to determine what information can be transferred, what must be retained, and who remains responsible for it. In those moments, customer support is not just a convenience. It becomes part of the practice's operational stability and potentially part of its risk management. I think many of us have experienced the frustration of reaching out for help and receiving an automated response that does not actually address the problem. You explain the situation, you receive a generic article, you explain it again, you're transferred to another department. Meanwhile, your clinician still waits. They work, your clients still need care, and the issue has not been addressed. That's why the people behind the system really matter so much to me. I've known the founders of Checkpoint for many years, and those people I respect personally and professionally. I hold them in high esteem, and I trust them. And I do not use the word trust casually, especially when we're talking about systems responsible for highly sensitive clinical information. Trust does not mean expecting that a product will never have a limitation or that a question will never arise. Trust means believing that when a question does arrive, the people involved will listen, communicate honestly, and work with you toward a responsible solution. And I think that has tremendous value. Checkpoint is hosting this webinar, and I sincerely appreciate that. I want to acknowledge that, but I just want to say it again. My record with them gives me a great deal of confidence to be able to share those comments. So a good system gives us useful tools. Good service helps us use those tools effectively, and good people help us navigate the situations that do not fit neatly into a standard process. That combination is especially valuable in behavioral health, where our technology must support both operational needs and ethical responsibilities. And I'm looking at our time. I might skip to our next slide just to kind of be respectful to our time here. One of the biggest mistakes a practice owner can make is waiting until a letter of intent or even a purchase agreement is sitting in front of them before reaching out for professional guidance. At that point, the owner may already feel emotionally committed to the deal. They may have shared information they should not have shared. They may have agreed to terms they do not fully understand, or they may feel pressured by an artificial deadline and worry that asking too many questions will cause the buyer to walk away. That is not the best time to begin assembling your team. So my suggestion is for you to begin that process now. Identify your team. Identify your attorney. Identify your accountant. Understand your program and your practice. Is it an ownership or an equity transaction? Which liabilities remain with the seller? Which obligations move to the buyer? What problem does the transaction fix, both personally and professionally? What does this do for our clients? What does it do for our staff? What does it do for our clinicians? What representations are you making about your records, your billing, employees, contractors, and compliance? And what responsibilities continue after the transaction closes? You want those answers in plain language. I'm going to go ahead and jump to our next slide out of respect to time. The goal is to identify the risks clearly enough that you can decide which ones can be managed, which ones require stronger protections, and which ones should cause you to step away. To make that process easier to remember, I use a simple framework. Before you proceed, protect. This is not intended to replace legal advice, accounting guidance, or a formal ethical decision-making model. It's a way to slow the conversation down and make sure we are asking the right questions before making a decision that affects an entire organization. The first letter is P for people. Who will be affected by this decision? We naturally think about the buyer and the seller, but the transaction reaches much further. And I'm going to quickly kind of go to the rest of these. R is responsibilities. What are our ethical responsibilities? How will those continue after an acquisition? The O is for options. What real choices do people involved retain? Are we giving our clients choice? Do our clinicians have choice? T is for transparency. What needs to be communicated to whom and at what point in the process? Transparency does not mean disclosing confidential negotiations or sharing protected client information. It means avoiding misleading statements, hidden conditions, and promises we cannot support. E is for equity. And here I mean fairness, not necessarily ownership equity. Who receives the benefits of the transaction and who carries the risks? C is consultation. Who needs to be at the table before a decision is made? Who makes up my team of consultants? The final is T for transition. What happens after the agreement is signed? A closed date is not the end of the process. For clients and clinicians, it may just be the beginning. How will clients be notified? How will care continue? How will clinicians be retained, reassigned, or supported? How will supervision continue? How will access to records change? So the framework is people, responsibility, options, transparency, equity, consultation, transition, and then I would apply one final test. Could I explain this decision to a client, a clinician, a licensing board, or a respected colleague without hiding how or why it was made? I think it's a powerful question. If I would need to leave important information out, minimize someone's concern, or avoid explaining the real motivation behind this decision, I should probably slow down. A decision does not have to be perfect to be ethically defensible, but we should be able to explain the process we followed, the risk we considered, the people we consulted, and the safeguards we put in place. Protect gives us a way to organize that thinking before urgency, money, or emotion takes control of the process. And you do not have to wait for an acquisition offer to begin. I think we could go to slide 12, and I know we're pushing on time here, so I may slow down here. And I think rather than continue with this last slide, I'd like to maybe just give people an opportunity to ask any questions. I think obviously the nature of my presentation today really is guided from my position as a licensed counselor. And I think that's one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize today is just the ethical considerations when you entertain a possible acquisition. I want to thank everyone for making this possible and thank everybody that was here and give anybody an opportunity to ask any questions and hand it back off to you.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Let's see. So just have a couple of questions here. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see when practices are thinking about mergers or acquisitions?
You know, I think I lean back into this question of why did the client go to that clinic in the first place? Why did they select a particular clinician? And I think there's a very personal quality that leads to that. And when we look at acquisitions, sometimes that's done by larger organizations that are looking for systems. And certainly, like, I understood that on that side of things. But I think when the acquisition takes place, from the buyer's perspective and even maybe the seller's perspective, having discussions that really do acknowledge client choice and the personal nature of choosing a clinician in the first place. And that's a pretty quick response to that question.
Yeah, I'm sure it's loaded. Another question that we have, so, I know from going through an acquisition for an agency that I worked for, some of the scariest thoughts can come from your staff, right? So how do you recommend leaders talk to their staff about the merger and or acquisition?
Yeah, this is where I can really speak authentically. One of the biggest factors in the acquisition that I personally went through, I was given the opportunity to grandfather our clinicians in. And so what that meant is we were able to keep them on the same pay structure, expectation as ours. Like, their role did not change. And that actually was not how it was being done on a number of other clinicians that were being acquired in North Carolina. And so I think I went into those discussions being very protective of our staff. And yeah, can you read the question one more time? Because I want to make sure I'm answering that. But I think that's, yeah, kind of where my mind goes in hearing that question.
Yeah, so how do you approach the subject of a merger or acquisition, like, with your staff? Because I think, it's usually as soon as they hear that, it's probably a scary thought.
The delicate process. It is a delicate process. And I will say, my group practice, I had already established what I feel like was a trust and even a loyalty among one another. What I found extremely challenging is being in the role as the VP of operations and coming into a practice that went into this same kind of process and not knowing those people. That discussion was much, much more difficult. For my personal practice that was acquired, those relationships were already formed, and I feel like that trust was already established. So it was a much easier conversation. And I made sure that they could remain as is. Now, we had a grandfather clause for our clinicians, and they were able to keep that. So that made that process a little bit easier for the organization that was acquired from me.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, so I think that's all of the questions that we have. But yeah, what a wonderful presentation. I do appreciate the thoughtfulness and the care that you've put into mergers and acquisitions, which is typically very, formal, lawyers, accountants, that type of thing. I think folks can oftentimes forget about the people, right, that are behind it, and how to, thoughtfully go through that process. So yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who has attended. Reminder, there will be a recording that goes out after this. And then if there's any questions that we didn't get to answer, definitely feel free to reach out. I'm sure Troy will not mind answering those for you. But yeah, so thank you again, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.